Namaskar, Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. I have with me, if I may say, a very good friend, Cleo Paskal, who's going to talk about geopolitics with us. What's happening in America, China, and of course the Indo-Pacific. That's something which is going to be in the news, if I may predict that ways. Thank you so much. Namaskar and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. It's been too long.
Absolutely, it's been too long, and a lot has happened. So there's a lot of ground to cover as well.
Yeah, there certainly is. Yeah, and I'm in. Just in case anybody was wondering about my digital backdrop here, because you may see people walking through my digital backdrop, so to speak. I'm in Palau at the moment,
Wow.
and yeah,
So she's
it's
having a vacation, and I'm disturbing her. Thank you so much.
I, I wish I wish it was a vacation. This is a country that recognizes Taiwan and is under constant PRC political warfare attack. So I'm here to learn from the real frontline experts in the Pacific Islands, the people in Palau, about what's going on and what they need.
Palau is an interesting country, especially. I mean, I read the article that you wrote for the Sunday Garden, very interesting. And, I know this region because my interest in the Second World War.
Yes.
This is one poor place that went from country to country to country to country, literally like a gift. Okay, we are leaving. There you go. Next. It was literally like that. And it's a pity, as a matter of fact, for the people in that area. I'm sure that they should get what they want. But how do you look at what China is up to right now? Let's open with China. I see the Chinese kind of easing up a bit. Xi Jinping kind of not losing ground, but his values, in quotes, are not being adhered to by the CCP. Is there some change that you see in the Chinese Communist Party, or am I just, overanalyzing?
No, well, I defer to you. I don't know the inner workings of the Communist Party. Or not, it's not really something I know much about. I look more at what happens when the PRC crosses its borders, or the or the borders the world recognizes, opposed to the borders that it claims, and starts to do activities. So I was in the Philippines before coming here, and as I spoke to a lot of Filipino, learned from a lot of Filipino colleagues there, and China is certainly not ramping down its activities there. And big shout out, if I may, to the Filipino people and leadership and military. They are burdening the world's weight on their shoulders, standing up to what the PRC is trying to do in Filipino waters. And it's very important that they've adopted this procedure of radical transparency, where they uh, they're showing what the PRC is doing, and which is great. Everybody's always said, "Well, this is what you need to do. You need to show this terrible behavior." The problem is, if you just show the behavior and then China gets away with the behavior, then all you've done is given a political warfare gift to China, because China can then go to other countries like Malaysia or wherever and say, look, we got away with this in the Philippines and nobody helped the Philippines. So why bother standing up to us? You're going to be left on your own anyway. So the Philippines has done as much as they possibly can. It's not just the boats. I mean, if you that Alice Guo thing about this, Chinese sleeper agent who became a mayor of a Philippines town, they arrested her. They're dealing with this political warfare offshore, onshore. It's riddled through their system, and they're really trying to fight with courage and intelligence and tenacity. And now the question is, what do we do about it? And so from the basis of that kind of activity, or the sort of activity that I'm seeing the PRC doing here, and if in India sees in the border area, what I'm looking at is not so much peak China, as China reached its economic maximum or whatever. What I'm looking at is peak damage China can do, and it's far from the peak damage it could do, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down.
That's very interesting. The The funny thing is that China is kind of picking up, and I'm not at any point of time derailing Philippines with their effort, but they're a smaller country. The one thing that I'm noticing is China is kind of reducing its ambitions and not picking on the big guys. Is going after smaller countries that it can actually put that force into. Would you agree to that? Because previously the effort was more towards India, Japan, and stuff like that. Today with
Yeah.
India, he's kind of mellowing down. With Japan, he's mellowing down. But he wants to go after Philippines, which is rather small.
Well, there's that old Chinese saying of, you know, control the countryside to attack the city or something, whatever it is. You know, so if
Hmm.
you or control the ocean to attack the island. You know, so if you hit these smaller places and start to flip and weaken these smaller places, the bigger ones become isolated, and suddenly when they do try to move, it becomes much harder to move. That's, I think, one of the pieces of logic behind it. But also, countries like here in Palau, they talk about what's going on in the Philippines. So to India, Philippines is a smaller country, but to a lot of Pacific Island countries or regional neighbors in Southeast Asia, Philippines is a pretty big country.
Hmm.
So, you know, they're it- doing it is, I mean, there's another one, which is another Chinese saying, which is kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. You know, so, you know, it's not just because they're taking these bites doesn't
Hmm.
mean they want to eat the whole meal. It means, you know, they're nibbling around the edges, and suddenly you may find out uh, there's nowhere to move. And the other thing about the Philippines is it's a it's a defense treaty ally with the U.S. And so if the U.S. doesn't come to its aid in a time of need, it undermines U.S. credibility across the region. U.S. has 5 treaty allies uh, in in the Pacific region, right? So Japan, Australia, Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. And you know, it shakes the confidence of the other countries that the U.S. will show up when needed. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's part of the Quad discussions. I think I actually saw in the readout, the Quad readout, some mention of some project related to the Philippines. So it's not the sort of way that the U.S. fights, but it seems, unfortunately, to be quite effective.
Let's talk about that. One of the things that you mentioned right now is US credibility. And with the way that the Philippines literally stood up to China in the previous instances, especially after, the whole Dalai Lama thing happened. Nancy Pelosi came to India, and we all thought, the Chinese pushback will come towards India. They will make big statements and this and that. But the very next week, they started up a standoff in Philippines. So everybody thought, okay, fair enough. This is the response that the Chinese are giving. uh, the US hasn't come and shown the kind of gumption to protect or to stand by Philippines. There was that incident where Filipino Navy people lost their fingers. It was a scuffle. They called it in Philippines. They called it the Galwan of Philippines. Um, and there was a lot of negative sentiment with regards to US not kind of coming in the fore and warning China or kind of showing some strength. How do you think the region looks at it?
I don't know the so just to go back to the U.S. thing. So while I was in the Philippines, Admiral Paparo, who's the head of Indo-Pacific Command, made statements about being, you know, about the U.S. wanting to uh, help the Philippines. Um, I was at an event where the defense minister of Philippines. It was actually quite a difficult moment. He made a very eloquent speech, and then he said it was a meeting. There was about 30 countries in the room, and he said at the meeting, um, publicly, it was a public meeting, we need help. And for a proud country's minister of defense to stand up there and say we need help is uh, heartrending, really. He shouldn't be in that position. After that, Admiral Paparo went on the record by saying, you know, that the U.S. Would stand by the Philippines. I think there's a lot going on that isn't public, but and this is again, and hopefully we'll get to it. The relationship between India and the U.S. The U.S. is not monolithic. State Department and the White House and the Department of Defense are all, well, State Department and the White House are very similar, but State Department, Department of Defense are very difficult. So I suspect that the Department of Defense is doing what it can in a lot of different ways in the Philippines to help the Philippines. But ultimately, that decision to send an American naval ship to the Sierra Madre is a political decision. Um, and so I'm not sure what goes into quantify that. And it's not, you know, the signaling on the State Department side is really unfortunate because a lot of the same team that's on State Department now is the same team that was around when the Philippines lost Scarborough Shoal. I mean, they're a lot of the same people. Actually, the same people were in that
Exactly
administration.
same.
Yeah. So that it doesn't. Uh, that's you talk about lack of trust from the Philippines side. Strike one was Scarborough Shoal, right?
Mm.
Strike two was not backing up the Philippines in a tangible way after the tribunal legally said that China shouldn't, that these are Philippines reefs or whatever they are. And now we're getting towards what hopefully won't be strike three. But for the Philippines, the story didn't start last week. It started over a decade ago, and a lot of the same people are there. So uh, there are, but at the same time, there are other sections of the U.S. It's a democracy. It's designed to have multiple sections that definitely would like a different path forward.
How do
Uh,
you how do you interpret this? Because I mean, it's like a tug of war between these various. I mean, I would call it silos within the U.S. establishment. You have the State Department going one direction. You've got the Defense Department going the other direction. The White House sometimes I mean, today's White House especially is clueless. It's more under the State Department. Sometimes it jumps over to the defense. It kind of keeps balancing itself in the middle. How does a country who's wanting to work with the US even identify what to do? Because today we know for a fact that the defense and the White House are powerless. The game is being run by the state through and through.
yeah, state, National Security Council is actually what's supposed to coordinate all of it for the White House. But um, I mean, I think taking the India example, um, uh, and hopefully we can talk about Bangladesh because I'd like to learn a bit more from Bangladesh about what's going on in Bangladesh now. And as you know, it's very difficult to find out from the Western press about what's going on in Bangladesh. So, and I'm laughing, but it's not funny.
Yes, no,
It's sort
it's
of,
terrible.
yeah, it's a yeah. Um, so from what I understand from what's going on the U.S. side, and you can see a little bit from the fact that they're finally forced or they're finally having the Quad meeting, right? That uh, State Department seems to be on one track with India, but the cooperation with the Department of Defense actually seems to be going very well, and that was something that Jaishankar himself sort of. I mean, he didn't specify it was DoD, but he specified that there was a lot going on, and I suspect that's not necessarily. Well, I think that's probably more on the defense side, which is actually what India is interested in anyway. Um, but the problem that's what creates the problem is that the cooperative, mutually supportive actions that are happening are probably going to be more effective if they're not reported in the Western press, and so they can't be identified and attacked by, for example, PRC political warfare elements within the U.S. or Wahhabi elements within the U.S. And also, just by their nature, it's probably better if they're kept more quiet. So the result is that the the louder voices uh, are are the ones which are these more, like say, on the problematic side that are being heard. That said, uh, uh, the what happened in Bangladesh is just kind of sort of it shows that there's not just if something is going on the state side, it doesn't mean it doesn't have defense implications. So yeah. Oh, can't hear you.
It does, because 3 days after the whole operation was taken through, US Naval Institute writes an article about how strategically important is Bangladesh. So,
Yeah, this
it's
was
not coincidence. You're like, okay, fair enough. And if I may, this whole design of having something in Bangladesh is not new.
Mhm,
When back in the day, 1970, Yahya Khan was met up by the US officials and he was asked for a base, which he agreed, right? And the whole pogrom in Bangladesh that was conducted by the Pakistani army, a lot of people believe was within the sanction of the US, because these were the guys who wanted to give the US base, and the other guys, which was led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, did not. When India intervened, it was obviously, you remember the kind words that were spoken about our prime minister by Nixon. I mean,
mhm,
the B word. And then after that, then you have a situation where they went back to Sheikh Mujib in 1973, 72, 73, and said, we had a deal with the East Pakistanis to get this base. What do you have to say? He said, get lost. And a year and a half
mhm,
later, he dies. So
mhm.
this sort of an interference, we know it's been there for a long time, and the US does this. But the challenge is that strategically, when you look at it, this is a very tactical move what they've done in Bangladesh. Uh, Strategically, when you do things like this, it doesn't actually bow well for the powers that be in America, because the trust factor within allies, and you see statements coming out of Australia as well, right? Australia as an ally. Australia has come out and said what has happened in Bangladesh is shameful. It was said in their parliament. So,
Sorry, I didn't see that. So, as I said, there's
yeah.
very little reporting here. So, what was
So
what was said in Australia?
the environment and culture minister basically came out and said that there is a pogrom happening with regards to the minorities in Bangladesh.
Mhm,
It is very concerning. Yesterday, the Foreign Office from the UK, of course, pressured by Hindu groups and everything, had to write a letter saying that, what's happening in Bangladesh is not okay.
mhm.
Biden and Modi had a conversation when Modi said, we are concerned about Hindus in Bangladesh. He put it out in his readout. Biden didn't.
Yeah,
And
I
then
saw
when
that. That I
he
saw. Yeah.
was he was cross questioned by an Indian journalist, your Admiral, what's his name, John Kirby. Uh, he had to admit it. So that was literally a blackface. I mean, you're what are you trying to hide?
So to be clear, just so he's not mine because I'm Canadian,
No,
but you can
I'm just
accuse
saying,
me as a
not you, as
Canadian
in.
of a lot of different things. So we can also go to the Calistani topic if you want.
I'm not saying you, but what are
Yeah,
you
yeah,
trying to hide? As in, what are the Americans trying to hide? I mean, we know what has happened. Nobody's a fool.
yeah.
You know.
So just for those who may not have been, I mean, people who follow your show obviously will be more up to date, but some people may be finding this show for other reasons because they want to hear about the latest Canadian hockey scores, for example. But what is the latest for uh, the the situation for minorities in
It's terrible.
I mean the Hindu
Terrible.
situation, the targeted horrific attacks on Hindus right at the beginning was just appalling, and then they seem to be extended to a phase where there's sort of an institutional purging, and
Yep.
now what's going on?
It's not just the Hindus. Hindus are the main target. There's no question. I want to ask the West, which is predominantly a Christian, setup. What's happening to the churches in Bangladesh? Nobody cares. The Archbishop put out a statement saying that we can't operate. We are under threat. Nobody cares. Funny thing is that this is a country. The problem with these Islamic nations is that there is a predominant rise of the extreme, a radicalized extreme that comes across. And what was used by the powers that be to kind of do this regime change or whatever you want to call it was the Jamaat, was the Islamists, was the radical Islamists. Now they're in power. And when they're in power, you know what happens. I mean, there's pogroms, there's genocide, there's breaking of all sorts of religious, uh, sensitivities. There's killing. There's killing is the least of it. Let me just say that. I mean, it's just so rampant. It's normal. And when we've been warning the Americans, don't do this. Don't do this. We've said this. As a matter of fact, Prime Minister Modi himself told Joe Biden during the G20, don't do this. This place is volatile. It'll explode. It'll be for no one's good because, but then fair enough. This is what has happened. And see, the thing is, I find the understanding of, especially the State Department, the people who did this, I know. It's Peter Haas, it's John Danilowitz, it's Donald Lu, it's all these guys who came out and did all this stuff. And there's enough evidence of them interacting with student groups, interacting with, of course, the army. Would you believe it? The junior officers within the army. What's the American State Department doing interacting with junior officers in the Bangladeshi army is besides me. And they do that with India as well. I mean, you look at it, our opposition leaders there, uh, they facilitated meetings with all sorts of radical elements. And this is facilitated, we know, by the American State Department. They're doing the same thing inside India today. Meeting with all sorts of anti-national elements, meeting with opposition leaders, fueling them. They do this. But India is not that easy to kind of throw off because it's a large country. Something that resonates in the north does not resonate in the south. Something that resonates in the east does not resonate in the west. And you see what's happening in Manipur. I mean, there is written, documented evidence of the northeast being wanted as a crown colony against China. This is 1950s, and they're trying to do that now. So it's the point is that when friends and allies are going to be treated as if it's my interest, I will look at it and I will do what I want to. Well, there is not going to be, it's going to be reciprocal, right? And then they, after that, keep on saying, why doesn't India become an ally? Why would India want to become an ally? When you treat our neighborhood the way you do, I mean, you look at Pakistan, look at Bangladesh, look at Sri Lanka, look at Myanmar, look at Nepal, all of them have interference. So there's this that innate mistrust, which I don't think is going to go, and it's becoming worse in India, let me assure you. People rather today in India sit down with Russia and China and figure out how to take things forward than to sit with the Americans.
Mhm. So I think, yeah, I'm. This is a critical issue, and I watched obviously some of the things that were on X and some of those sorts of discussions, and a big part of the problem was I would see uh, Indian experts or commentators very, I mean, people like Ramachaleni. I mean, people who, are normally pretty
Pro
even.
West.
I mean, they are, yeah,
He
I
wrote
mean,
such a scathing
yeah,
article about the American interference in Bangladesh.
yeah, uh, and and putting it out there very and in scathing, but very m- reasoned. And then the response on the American side is not nothing better than name calling,
No, I was
right?
like, oh, show us your sources.
Yeah.
Okay, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to show you my sources. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there's that, but there's also a lot of just complete denial,
Yeah.
this is all wrong. This is a complete lie. There's no actual attempts to well, that I saw, um just have the discussion. I mean, because you can't, whatever happened, and you can't if you are truly an ally, or if or you want to become a partner, you need to listen, and acknowledge that you may not know everything either, right? And just try to have a ideally public discussion about these very serious concerns. And I was actually grateful to the Indian community, the strategic community, for talking about it publicly, because talking about their concerns publicly, because that's the only way that, and of course Bangladeshis as well. I mean, it wasn't just India, but uh,
Yeah.
you know, but that's the only way that you can build trust. And so India is doing its part to build trust. It's seeing something uh, that is really horrible, and trying to talk about it, and trying to talk about concerns about some of the things that are behind it that have larger implications. And I'm just unless I've missed it, I'm just not seeing the same thing on the US side. I'm not seeing
No,
an attempt to truly engage on on these concerns.
you
And
have State
the
Department officials, sorry to interrupt you, you have State Department
Please.
officials telling us today that Indians haven't learned from their history in Bangladesh. Uh, we will help Muhammad Yunus. And since Modi does not want to meet Muhammad Yunus, we are sure we will keep Muhammad Yunus busy rather than meeting Mr. Modi. This is a State Department official who's actually tweeted this out on X. Now, I
Yeah.
mean, you can be brazen, you can be arrogant, but fair enough. Don't rile up emerging power, because you will face challenges going forward. And you are going to face challenges. Look at the factor that right now Prime Minister Modi is in America with the Quad meet. And what does the White House do? Meet Khalistanis. Just before Prime Minister Modi lands, they meet the Khalistanis and assure them of safety. Fair enough, no problem. Khalistanis are feeling threatened. I'm happy. I love it. Uh, smiling. But we also have the BRICS summit in October. What do you think we're going to do there?
Yeah, it's
So we have
I
options. It's not that.
there's a lot. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot that I mean, the, I India has a very informed, sophisticated, and restrained MEA. And they've been handling this with grace, I have to say. I'm sorry we're that this is even an issue, because we have we two of the biggest existential enemies of this era are coming after all of us, right? You've got your neighbor to the north, and those elements that you're talking about in Bangladesh, right? They're not discriminating against. They're coming after all of us. And so for this sort of behavior to be fracturing what should be natural relationships is uh almost looks like it's a byproduct of successful operations by one or two or both of those elements, right? Um, and the As I said, the Indian side is doing its bit. You're from and the civil society part is doing it. The journalists are doing it. The MEA is doing it, and I think that when you're acting in that sort of an open way and trying to debate and things, that's how you find your your true partners. And it may not be in certain elements of the US now, but I think you'll find other countries in the region responding to it well, in the same way that, for example, the Philippines, may not. I don't know what response they want from the US, but if they're not getting it, they're certainly starting to get a lot more support from Japan, for example. So you be you and be sort of honest and forthright and moral as much as possible in this world. And you never know what friends you're going to find. And you know, uh, that's that's the sort of most positive spin I could possibly put on what's a horrific situation.
funny thing is that the Americans have always been petrified of the Russians being in the Indian Ocean, right? This has been there. You remember the whole Afghanistan issue. The warm waters of the Indian Ocean was the narrative at that time. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Um, Today, India is going to bring the Russians into the Indian Ocean. We've done exercises in the Bay of Bengal. We've done exercises in the Indian Ocean. We've got a logistical agreement going on with the Russians. So, the point is that that's what I was trying to mention, and I want your opinion. The American strategic community is not a strategic community, it's become a more tactical community. They want this immediate gratification of beating you know, putting a stick on someone's head, but in the long term, they're not able to see where what is going. Do you see that as a challenge? Because you were also pretty frustrated about Micronesia, Polynesia, and the last time when we had a
Yeah, yeah,
conversation, if you
yeah,
remember,
yeah.
they were just not acting. What do you think is this? Is this a complete lack of understanding, or is it, as I said, strategic versus tactical?
So I think that's a generous framing. Um, the U.S. is. Have you been to the U.S. lately?
Thankfully, no.
No, I recommend you go.
No.
It's no, I'm serious because um, it's gone insane. I mean, you should go down to the border or like if you think what US governance is doing to the world is bad, you should see what US governance is doing to the US. The number of
Yeah,
people unvetted that are coming across the border. I mean, everybody's knows the issue of Springfield now, right? Where apparently the Haitians are eating pets. I mean, I don't know whether they're eating pets or not, but I think that the sheer fact that you took a pretty small sized town and you put in about 30% new population that doesn't speak English with no budgetary support. um, India knows this dynamic very well. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, that's who are you
disaster.
doing that? Who are you doing that for? Most of those Haitians weren't didn't come from Haiti. They were settled already in Latin America, so they speak Spanish to a certain degree. But that this opportunity showed up, and this is kind of one small case. And the criminal element is secondary. It's just what it does to the school services and the health services if there's no support. And these were not, from the research that I've seen, people that were at imminent risk in the location where they were before they came to Springfield. So that's a very small example of a dynamic that's happening all across the all across the country. Um, the the open border, which is a situation. I mean, they've got hundreds of designated terrorists that they know have come across the border and haven't been restrained. And this is a time when, I mean, look at the assassination attempts on former President Trump. I mean, and they know. I mean, the Iranians are on the record as saying, they're going to try to kill him, and you've got an open border and very odd security procedures. So I what you're seeing out in India or out in the region or whatever is obviously not ideal, unusual behavior for the U.S. But a lot of Americans across the political spectrum similarly are not understanding the behavior of their own governance at the moment.
But that surprises me because, and we talk about that quite a bit in India. We always say that, in that, how will they treat us properly when they don't treat themselves? So fair enough. I mean, if we are nationalists, we'll kind of hold our country together. I don't see that over there. So the collapse there is going to be much faster.
Well,
Uh,
and you see, I mean, the U.S. system is a very interesting system. It's supposed to build. It has redundancies in it, and the power of the states in context of the federal. And actually, you saw it very clearly during COVID, where some U.S. states were completely locked down, and others were pretty much open. I mean, at the same time that there were, you know, people couldn't really leave their homes in New York, there were buffet restaurants open in Texas. Like, it was completely different, right? And it's very interesting. The founding documents of the U.S. are are very insightful into human behavior and into building in redundancies. Are very worth reading if nobody has. I mean, the U.S. Americans will talk on and on about American exceptionalism, and it's easy to discount a lot of it, but it's very unusual to have a country that was so deliberately created and with checks and balances of this sort. It is worth taking a look at. But there was a piece recently in Global Times, in China's Global Times, which talked about how finally the system was breaking down. And the way that the piece was written, it really it was almost, I mean, if you remember the book Unrestricted Warfare, by the two PLA Air Force colonels in 1999, and they talked about all these ways, and reading this Global Times piece, and it was presented as, "Oh, what a shame," but it actually felt like gloating, and you could
Mhm.
see it was mentioning systematically areas that had broken down and that you kind of felt like had been targeted, like the political party system, right? The Chinese they go after the political party system because they want a one-party state. But the first president in the US, George Washington, actually was not a member of a political party. And in his farewell address, he wrote about the dangers of political parties.
Yep.
So his solution wasn't a one party state. It was very much the opposite. It was, you need to not have the parties stand between the electorate and the elected. Otherwise, the elected will serve the party, they won't serve the electorate.
Hmm.
Right. And then the outside influences, and he specifically mentions foreign influences, will use the political parties to um, capture the politicians. Right. And you can see all of this sort of funding from all kinds of sources. So as usual, kind of the Chinese identify a real problem, blow it up, make it bigger, and give you the wrong solution. But that article was almost like a victory lap of
Yep.
how very targeted, I think, at least partially CCP linked operations have attempted to break down key elements of the democratic institutions that underpin the US.
Yep.
So, yeah. So I think, this is, I think partially what you're seeing out in the region is an echo of very focused over decades, funded with infinite amounts of money, many of it made off of American businesses through intellectual property theft and whatnot. Attempt by the CCP to, uh, uh, if not capture, then destroy key elements of U.S. democracy. So it's not it's all it's interlinked. The U.S. domestic catastrophic policies that we're seeing, are not disaggregated from some elements of U.S. foreign policy, which is also uh, creating a problem. To my view.
No, I mean you've elucidated this very very beautifully. If might I add something to you, in the sense that one of the biggest things that we see, because we were part of this opium wars, if you remember, in the 17 1800s, the Chinese are doing the same thing to the Americans, exact same
Yeah.
things. Control the flow of opium and you control a country, and they're controlling the flow of drugs and they're controlling the country. Simple as that. The
So
point is,
I would. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, please.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm interested. Please.
The point is that the that's where again I keep saying that the American establishment has become too tactical in nature. They rather beat their chest and say, "Oh, see, we beat the thing about them. Oh, Modi's coming. See, we met the Khalistanis. Damn good. Oh, that these damn Indians." In the long term, it doesn't make a damn of a difference. In the long term, you're losing a strategic partner that is the strongest power in this nation, in this part of the region. You're antagonizing someone who is a central balancing force right now, who you need for Ukraine, who you need for the Chinese. You know, the Chinese and Indians today, the Chinese ambassador day for yesterday literally said two, three things. He said, we want to rebuild the confidence. There's one big factor between China and India, which in terms of trade used to be that they never used to let us access their markets. He's saying, sir, please come, access our markets. Now, the point is, you have a partner here who obviously will not sit with the Chinese. It's not going to happen because we have our own pathway. What if we do? The American led global order goes for a toss. I sincerely don't understand what the main game is, because for these little tactical advantages, they lose the strategic picture. You look at what they're doing with Saudi Arabia, look at what they're doing with India, look at what they're doing with Japan. I mean, the current prime minister has an approval rating of 23%. I mean, it's not going to work in the long term. But the point is, that this is a country, this is an establishment which is what, 400 years old. Traditional civilizations like ours, Japanese, Chinese, we've been there for thousands of years. So for us, it's like, okay, fair enough. You can keep playing your games. You won't be there tomorrow for us to figure it out. We'll survive. We've survived and we will survive. So that's the kind of logic where a lot of the Westerners are leaving it in our mouths that rubbish them. We take what we need from the Americans today, because the Americans have technology, they have the certain things that you require. We'll take it, we'll keep quiet. But the day we come up to a point where we can tell them to shut up and get lost, that's what is going to happen. So the exclusionism will become inclusivism, if I may use that word. If I've invented a
I
new word, my apologies.
yeah. Uh, no, I certainly understand. I just just a few quick things. Um, One is um, I don't consider China a continuation of 4,000 years of culture. If anything, it might be Taiwan, but it certainly isn't. It isn't China. So I bring that up very deliberately because that's an indication of why the U.S. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if we have this conversation in a year and there's a different fund administration in the US, whether things will be very different in the US because between US and India. Because, for example, the last Trump administration, the relationship with India was good. And I mean that the Quad was reborn, the defense cooperation agreements were signed. Um, there was a lot more integration, and that that is underpinned by something that is worth mentioning, which is how at a fundamental level, uh, in generally Indo-Americans f- do extremely well in the American system. And it's and which is and very quickly within the first when you would land in the US, very quickly things tend to go quite well. In fact, that's why there I mean, take a look at all the Indo-Americans that are across the political spectrum in the US, from Kamala Harris to Vivek Ramaswamy. You've got the ability to very quickly which is not something. I mean, in spite of you can talk about 5,000 years on both sides, but you're not going to be seeing an Sino-Indian becoming a leader in China anytime soon, right? So, and that's the same across the board within the US system, within, in education and in technology and in media. Very, the compatibilities are very strong. And I'm hoping that will ride out the whatever insanity you see at the administration level to show how at a deep cultural and personal level there's this compatibility. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has is violently against people of faith, and it's violently against the family. I mean, it was the one child policy is the most unhuman thing you can imagine. And so if you're talking kind of top level strategic this and that, that's fine. But when you're sitting across the table, when the average Indian goes out to dinner with the average CCP member, um, I'm not sure that there's much of a heart to heart connection there. I mean, the Indian can talk about things that live in their head on a daily basis, like the problems with their extended family. That CCP member doesn't have an extended family. The Indian carries within them their faith, which determines their relationship to the infinite and the divine. Very few CCP members have that. In fact, they will actively prosecute and persecute people of faith. Um, so, you know, I think that just in terms of where those natural alignments are, um, it might be more clear to see when you look at the personal level, just as a human being, rather than at the grand strategic, what seems logical in a hard, cold strategic sense. Um, but completely understand that country to country, in what the U.S. is doing now, both domestically and internationally, can create a risk. If you don't want to know what you want to know who you can depend on. Um, so just to broaden that out, the other thing about the Opium Wars is that the British didn't weren't trying to deliberately kill the Chinese drug addicts. They were trying to suck the silver out of China. Fentanyl killed 70,000 Americans last year, and and is and in total has probably
It's
killed.
worse.
Well, I think it's different. I think that
Yeah.
there's a deliberate attempt to destroy the society from the inside, but not for economic benefit. I think the British were about the money. I think the Chinese will lose money if it gets lets them destroy the society. Right? The British were destroying the society to get the money. The Chinese will lose money to destroy the society. So the question is, what is the end goal for that flooding in of drugs? Because drug dealers usually don't want to kill their clients. And it's a bad business model. So for me, if they're killing this many, they're doing it on purpose, and they're doing
Yep.
it for a different end.
Yep.
And the end is you kill one person, you kill a family. You
Yeah.
know, you so they're decimating the society from the inside, not for economic gain. That's the point. The
It's
point,
it's
yeah,
basically to break it down, and that's something
yeah,
that the Americans fail to understand. This is an interesting conversation, I must say. We've actually focused quite a bit on the American foreign policy, and if you look at, you mentioned Trump, and you mentioned this thing. We in India, how we look at it, and I want your comments on this. Is that uh, looking at how polarized the last election was. In India, whatever said and done, it was a polarized election, heck in a handbasket fight. But when the results came, everybody said, fair enough, stick a cork in it, move forward. There is political infighting, there is political this, there is political that, but nobody questions the results of the election. Nobody's short of an armed insurrection, which is what we see might happen in the States today. And so when we look at it from a further perspective, we're like, okay, fair enough. You did what you did. Look what's going to happen inside you. Because, if Trump is not allowed to win, we know he's going to win if there's free and fair elections. Imagine somebody in the third world, so called, is talking about the first world elections not being free and fair. That's irony number one. The second is, will there be an armed insurrection? Because the last time guns almost came out. This time the guns are already out. People have been shooting at each other. I mean, you've had an assassination attempt on a former president of the country, not once, twice. It's unbelievable. And feel like, okay, fair enough. You may have the watch. We've got the time. Let's watch what happens. So that's the narrative that is being played in India. Fair enough, you can trouble us all you want. As I said, you may have the watch. We have the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of that, so I mean, this opens up a whole bunch of different topics.
Yeah.
One of them is, again, going back to this Global Times article, that that the the denigration of the concept of democracy, um, and the concurrent, through the with the Chinese narrative, saying, look, your cradle of your shining beacon on the hill, your light on the hill is dimming. In fact, they said that in the article. So the alternative is the Chinese model, which is one of the reasons, again, why India is so important internationally, because it it shows that there isn't just one democracy in the world, and that. So anyway, but that's another issue, and that's why India's G20 stuff was so important. But anyway, but back to the US thing. This is why I really think it would be helpful for you and for your viewers, for you to go to the US, because it is what's happening in the US now, and especially around the election, is one of the most important moments in the hundreds years of US history. This is an incredibly important moment in time. And you're getting um, uh, the echoes of it. But what's going on in the States is the result of, I think, again, decades of very successful operations, and a key component of that was taking over the universities. Because where does State Department hire from? It hires from all of those elite universities, right? And who's how comfortable is it to be Jewish or a Hindu on those campuses now? And that didn't happen accidentally.
Mhm.
So this is a key moment in a very long operation, and this election is going to be incredibly important. Everybody says every election is incredibly important. This U.S. election truly is. Um, so whatever you side you think you're on, um, and uh, it I don't know what's going to happen in terms of violence or not. Um, uh, it's uh, and I mean, everything, all the points that you raised, the questions about election integrity, the questioning of the outcome, all that sort of stuff, they're all issues that millions of Americans are wondering the same thing,
Yeah.
and uh, and are uh, some are. I mean, I've never had so many people tell me. It's funny. It used to be that during elections, people would say, "Well, if I don't get my way, we're going to move to Canada." Right? They're they're not anymore, right? But they are talking about moving to northern Wyoming or Montana or something like that,
Texas.
and you can see,
Texas.
yeah, not even, not even. You're because
Really?
there's yeah, oh yeah, because of yeah, I mean, it depends on which side you're on, but Texas is not monolithically Republican or Democrat. Um, so, but you're seeing, there's an article recently about the number of Democrats buying guns. Um, it's, I
Yeah,
mean,
I saw that. That was
yeah,
funny.
and yeah, and it's petrifying. And if you read, if you see the media, it's completely bifurcated. And the it and the media that for example, polling. The polling in the U.S. is largely political. The outcomes of so if so in my case, when I'm trying to understand where the actual polling is, I'll mention the name. There's one pollster that I look at, a guy called Rich Barris, because he publicly funds his polling. So you know exactly where the money for the polling is coming from, and it's just coming from individuals, and it's public polling. So, and his results are quite good. Um, uh, but he's considered, an extreme right wing or whatever. I mean, he's given a bunch of labels to try to discredit him, even though in the case of polling, you can actually see what was the polling and what was the outcome. So you can see whether somebody's reliable or not. It's not political. It's math. Um, but that's just a narrow example of how um, not the information is utterly politicized down to numbers, down to the numbers. And there's a it's very difficult to get reliable information. Most of it is emotive. When I started in journalism, the newspaper was about 90%. First of all, you had newspapers, but second of all, the newspaper was about 90% reporting and 10% editorial, and you had two different editors. If you were doing editorials, you reported to one. If you're reporting, you report to another. Then that different. It was very clearly defined. Now it's mostly editorial, and you can tell it when next time you're looking at a Western newspaper, if there are adjectives in the headlines, then you know that they're trying to control your thought about the story. So and so outraged, so and so frustrated, so and so offended. That's not reporting. That's a transmission of emotional content to try to get you to feel the way they want you to feel about something. And that's become pervasive. That the shift from that s- insertion of adjectives, of emotions into any piece of information that's being transmitted around this U.S. election. So it's very difficult to get information, and people know it, and it's like it was like your reaction. If the election is free or fair. Well, imagine you're an American voting, right? That dissuades you from voting. And who wins if you're dissuaded from voting? Because just because you don't use your ballot doesn't mean somebody else isn't going to use your ballot, right? That's the whole thing. So it is. I mean, we talked about at the beginning the U.S. and the region, and I'd like to say that I'm very grateful to you for this conversation, because you know this is the way through it. Just being able to talk about it, coming from different locations and different points of view, and I learned a lot. And um, and this is how we can work through it, um, internationally and domestically. And we talked about it initially internationally, and now we're talking about what's going on domestically. And I can tell you that all of those emotions that you're feeling, or and quite rightfully so, um, about perceived U.S. behavior, actual U.S. behavior in the region, is being felt even more so by Americans in the United States in the lead up to the election.
Well, I wish they do, and I wish they do something about it. Lastly, I'd like to ask you one small little kind of a addendum. The Chinese, the foreign policy of the Americans is basically based on Russia and China, and the backfire in Russia is phenomenal, if I may say this. This is going to be, I mean, the Russians are going to be beating drums about this for the next 100 years. That, see, they tried everything and they failed. Uh, Russians have got their way out pretty much everywhere. Africa, they're in. India, they're in. They've got their way with China. They've got their way with the Europeans, who are still buying oil from the Russians, by the way, through the pipelines that come through Ukraine. So, hell of a war that is. Um, you look at what's happening in the Middle East. Um, you tell Israel, don't do this. But then, yeah, do it. It's stick with it. So the indecisiveness of American foreign policy, especially with regards to China, the pivot to Asia was done by Barack Obama in 2012. They've not yet pivoted after 12 years. The indecisiveness of the American foreign policy today is going to be responsible for the downfall of the current global world order. And that is what people are seeing here. You look at the Indian Prime Minister, a lot of people don't look at his schedule. By the way, he's standing inside America and talking to a forum about multilateralism, which the Americans hate. So, you know, you kind of losing the game. So this is, I would say, a good time for them to get their foreign policy up, figure out who the real adversaries are, and work with your friends, allies, and partners to find a solution. But instead, what we see is a missed alignment. I'm just kind of rounding up the discussion and ask for your. You see a missed alignment. You see political narratives. You see tactical chest beating and drum beating. Uh, you travel across Southeast Asia, and I'm sure you're also hearing the same things from them. That we can't trust the Americans. They let us down. How does that bode for a country that wants to be the leader of the free world? How do they justify it to themselves? Is the State Department, is the White House so blinded by their own analysis, their own ecosystem, that they're not able to see the reality, or they think that in the long term this thing will work out? This is one question we don't understand. What do you say? What do you say to this?
So yeah, so two things. One is that I think I saw during the especially in the Indo-Pacific, the region during the Trump administration, there really was I think, a sincere effort to try to engage. So again, I would just say that a lot depends on the administration.
Hmm.
And there was a resurrection of the Quad. There was the signing of the defense treaty, the defense agreements with India. There was, and there was also very much of a they declassified their Indo-Pacific strategy just before they left office, and you can see it's all in there. It was very deliberate, and what one of the elements that I think was particularly effective was the encouragement of the building of stronger relationships between like-minded countries like Japan and India, which Japan and India have moved on ahead with, and I think is I think the Japan-India relationship is potentially one of the most important. Um, in the region and at this time. Um, so I'd say that it hasn't been a continuous decline, but it's certainly um, it has, because it has had those peaks and troughs. It does show that reliance on a country that can change with so quickly maybe isn't ideal. Um, but um, how do you you know I've worked with, I mean, I've trying to get through the compacts of free association for the freely associated states here, Palau, Marshall Islands. We talked about it before. I won't go through it again. But I spent the most time I've ever spent in my life in Washington, and that included talking to members of Congress and congressional staff, members of the State Department, things like that. And the educational system in the U.S. has created a cadre of people, of Americans, who uh, have it's a very odd duality. They think America is incredibly strong and and has does all these things, but they're anti-American in that they hate what they've been taught of as American imperialism. So they're trying, it's this sort of, anti-colonial, the US is a systemically racist, we're a horrible, terrible country, which is what you learn in a lot of universities. But they also think it's infinitely strong for some reason. So they think that they can um, push around parts of the world while being self-loathing. And it creates incredibly just dysfunctional and confusing outcomes like you're talking about. And I think that there's a lack of understanding, first of all, that the US is weakening substantially. And if you look at the state of the US Navy, for example, that's very, very clear. And that that their values framework, um, of this kind of very odd inclusivity, which doesn't include whole elements of society, is what needs to be enforced all over the world, comes together with other elements that are just like straightforward, uh, backed by lobbying money of special interest groups that know how to manipulate that kind of a person. And then you end up with this kind of insanity that you're seeing in other parts of the world. So there are a lot of different things going on, and
Well
we
said.
yeah, sorry.
No, well said, well said. I'm pretty impressed by what you said. It's you're absolutely right. It's a it's a paradigm that I don't think even the Americans are realizing which direction it's going. And trust you me, the day they do realize it, they will kind of be running around trying to find friends, and they're not going to find any. And let me assure you, Europe is the first one that will break away, and you can see that happening. And that's the sad part of it. This is a country which had so much potential. India, especially person to person, we like the country. It's a beautiful country, beautiful people, fantastic, work ethic, good, great research, great technology, done wonders in 400 years, superpower, uh, lots to learn. But today in India, if you ask the guy on the street, do you trust the Americans? He's going to say, I trust a snake. So that's the feeling on the
Yeah.
ground. I'm not, this thing, and
Oh,
somebody,
thank you for saying it, because the only way to fix it is if there's a way of fixing it, then you're doing what needs to be done to fix it, which is to say it. And
well,
yeah.
there's no other way. I mean, at the end of it, if you, and it's not me saying it. I get,
Oh, no,
I do podcasts with Americans as well. A lot of American podcasters will call me up, and I do podcasts with them as well. And they are also amazed. When I tell them about certain things, they're like, "What are you talking about?" When I told some people about the National Endowment of Democracy, here's this one guy. He's an American podcaster, and he's saying, "What?" I said, "Wait, let's pause this for a minute because I want you to understand." So he paused it, and then I said, "Okay, Google search National Endowment of Democracy, see their budget. It's like $50 billion." I'm like, "Yeah, exactly. That's what happens." And they had no clue about it. And that's the sad part that, within America, this conversation is just not there. So if any inkling of change that we would expect from America will not happen till the time Americans themselves are aware. So they've kept them dumb. They've kept them beer, football. Today it's what? Smoking weed, LGBTQ, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump. They've kept this thing alive so that they are kept away from the reality of life, that economy is in turmoil, the global order is in turmoil. They might just get attacked pretty badly with terrorists inside their country, as you mentioned, from these illegals coming inside. So it's I don't know.
I think most of many Americans know because they're living it, right? So that's why you see street interviews. I mean, many Americans know they, and I think that one of the things that because personally, as you know, I think that a lot of this is not inherent. I think that there was a deliberate, I call it, we talked about it, entropic warfare, right? This sort
Yeah,
of deliberate disintegration. And what you're starting to see, and I've seen it particularly over the last 3 or 4, since COVID really, is people trying to rebuild their communities from the ground level. So joining the school boards, because suddenly through COVID, they found out what their kids were being taught in school, and it horrified them. So now they're joining the school boards, they're joining the city councils, they're trying to, kind of rebuild, uh, in a very democratic way. It's the only way to do it from the ground up. So I think they're people know, they're just not being, many do, they're just not necessarily being reflected in the media, you know, and in the mainstream media, and that's why you're seeing the explosion of podcasts and um, uh, alternative forms of people learning from each other and things like that. It's not over, but again, uh, I think that this issue of how the U.S. is perceived um, is uh, it wouldn't I don't think it would surprise the average American because, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, um, shocked a lot of Americans. Americans didn't think the US would act like that again, right? Like after Vietnam. And so America's trust in its own foreign policy, it was shaken by Iraq, but the withdrawal from Afghanistan really affected a lot of Americans. So I don't necessarily think it would surprise them, and the weakening of the U.S. as well, and all that. But those views are not necessarily being widely represented in the media, and so you what you're saying and your point of view, I think you would find a lot of people in the U.S. who get it, but you're not finding each other because there's this layer between you of um, whoever they are, who are just kind of running off on their own tangent of how they think the world works, and creating a lot of suffering and misery, uh, and making the world a lot more dangerous. So please keep doing what you're doing, and hopefully more of us can find each other and break through that barrier. Uh, that's that's incredibly dangerous. But in the meantime, you might not trust the U.S. government, but a lot of Americans don't trust the U.S. government either. So you do have that in common.
I keep saying this. I keep saying this that, actually, I'd like to propose this online that we should have a conversation at least once a month or once in about 45 days so that we could kind of exchange notes on what's happening. It's only the contact with people to people. And I know the people there's nothing to do. I have no disrespect for the people. And as I said, I find it to be an amazing country with lots to learn. Um, and there is no animosity. For example, Indians have a lot of animosity with Pakistanis. People, people to people, there's animosity. There's nothing of that sort here. Uh, but you just don't trust the American establishment, and that's how it is. But I think you're
That's
absolutely right.
well put. That's well put.
Yeah,
That is the way to put it. It's the
yeah.
established. That is absolutely the right way to put it. And I think a
So
lot
I
of
call it.
Americans feel the same.
I call it. I'm going to say it right in the open. I call it the Gehra Rajya because it's the deep state.
I learned
Uh,
that one from you. I'm gonna have to-
yeah. So it's a safe word because if you say deep state too often, kind of YouTube gets, hey, what's he talking about? So that kind of gets a little put off. But that's the way it is. But thank you so much, Cleo. This was really, really a very interesting conversation on the American foreign policy, and I think it's important for us to learn because people like you and me are going to sit down and keep analyzing this stuff, and we need to kind of um, not just analyze but understand so that we could, one, inform, two, educate, three, uh, understand ourselves before anything else as to which direction the world is going, because the chaos we see coming in front of us is going to be interesting to say the least. So thank you so much for this time, and always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I always learn a lot. Thank you for your patience with me. Next
Thank
time,
you.
soon.